the basic idea is going to be this. What we do strategically in chapter 6 and chapter 8 is going to recur in chapter 13. And what we do tactically from chapter 6 and chapter 8 is going to recur in chapter 13. And then there's a parallel with respect to strategy between chapter 6, chapter 8, and chapter 13 for your intro and your elem rules for your quantifiers. Okay, so what I try to do in this set of slides is tackle the intro and elem rules in a way that I hope resonates with you. So I'm trying to start with the more straightforward or intuitive rules first. Okay, so to that end, what we're going to want to do when we're given quantified sentences in an argument is work our rules, our relevant rules, so that we can get the sentences in a position to assemble and dismantle according to our chapter 6 and chapter 8 rules. So take a look at the following syllogism, which is one you've probably seen in other philosophy classes, certainly in this logic class at some point in our text, or something similar. Right? All men are mortal. Socrates is a man. Therefore, Socrates is mortal. Now, without much deliberation, without much analysis, we draw the conclusion really easily, right? But what we don't realize that we're doing is making the following step. That is peeling off, if you will, the universally quantified, the universal quantifier, right? And then instantiating the variable, right? So we do something like this. Oh, well, if all men are mortal, then that means if Socrates is a man, Socrates is mortal, right? Or anybody we'd want to name. But we want to name Socrates. Why? Because if we say, if we replace the variable x with the name Socrates, now we've got an easy conditional elem move, right? So again, don't forget that the work we do in a derivation is a way of exhibiting, demonstrating the process of deriving the conclusion, right? As opposed to just seeing that the conclusion follows validly from the premises. So what we're going to want to be able to do is, and this is the language I use, may or may not be, may not resonate with you, but so I'll try other language as well, but we're going to peel off, right? We're going to instantiate. We are going to generate or generalize. Okay, so the peeling off and the instantiating, that's going to be our elimination, and the generalizing is going to be the introduction of your quantifiers. So the first one, I hope, is super straightforward for you. So when you have a universally quantified sentence, at any point in your proof, it doesn't matter if you're on the main line, on the main spine of the proof, or you're in a subproof, whether it's the structuring subproof or a nested subproof, right? You can peel off the quantifier, remove the quantifier, eliminate the quantifier, and replace the variable with a name. Right? Now going back to, I want to say it was Dirige's question about leaving a statement function, like leaving variables, pulling off the quantifier and leaving a variable. In some versions of the system, you can do that, right? So I can show you different textbooks where that's a go, but that's not what this version of the system, this textbook does. So take a look at the fact that in quantifier logic, the Socrates argument just involves one step extra. And I shouldn't say extra, that's not really accurate. It involves one more step than is required for the elimination of the conditional in propositional logic, right? So the citation process, it's the same as it always has been. And then when we're in Fitch, you'll see in our drop-down menu for the rules, we've got universal elem. Okay. Now, universal introduction is a little bit more complicated, but I'm hopeful that by the time we're done talking about it, you'll say, yeah, I get it. First off, just know that there are two versions of the rule. Second off, notice that universal intro is a subproof rule. So that means that it's a strategic rule. So here's what you're going to want to think about when you're contemplating how to approach setting up a proof for a given argument. When the sentence that you want to achieve, so let's just think for the moment the conclusion of the argument or the goal, but any sentence that you want to achieve is a universally quantified sentence, your go-to strategy is universal intro. Okay? Now I'm going to mark up the slide in just a second, but does it make sense that you're seeing on the far left, just look at your vertical lines. The far left, there's your initial vertical line, and then your indented vertical line is the subproof sequence for the universal intro rule. And then the same thing in the right side of the rule form. Main line and then indented sequence. Now, please just ignore for the moment the letter A outside of the parenthetical. I'll talk about that in a sec. What I'd like you to do, though, is cast your eyeballs down to the arrow. So the sentence reads as follows: for every x, if x is a p, then it's a q. Another way to say this is every p is q, or all p's are q's. So we know that the standard universal claim involves an arrow, and so you approach the proof by way of universal conditional intro, right? Remember conditional intro? Assume the antecedent, derive the consequent, so that you're saying, I've just proven that if I have the antecedent, then I have the consequent, or if I have P, I have Q. Okay? Now, why is it that when we exit the subproof, we introduce the universal? Here's why. So bear with me. In Fitch, this A is a hypothetical A. It's an arbitrary A. And we'll see in Fitch that it gets boxed up. Don't stress over these conventional sorts of things. You'll learn to work in it. Please know, though, that this A is not a name in the way that Deb is Deb's name and Lewis is Lewis's name. In other words, it's not the case that our hypothetical name, our randomly chosen name, our arbitrarily chosen name is going to refer to, an individual that you or I know. I mean, it might, but that's not how we're using it. You might say, wait a minute, Mia, what are you talking about? Well, here's the way that you can think about the red circled A. Right, so all P's are Q's. Okay, let's assume that there's this individual named Alfred or Alice or Alicia, right? Let's just assume there's this individual and that individual has property P. From that assumption, I derive the sentence that individual A has property Q. Here's the crucial moment now, guys. Because A is just randomly chosen, hypothetically named A. Hey, here's this individual named A. Let's suppose there's this individual named A. that individual named A is a stand-in for any individual, which is to say, we're now in a position to assert the generalization every individual. So every P is Q. Just on the verbal articulation, do you say, okay, all right, I got it? Or, not sure, thinking about it? Or, I don't know, Mia, I stopped listening a long time ago, just move on and I'll come back to it later. All right, I'm going to assume that you guys are just super happy right now. That's how I'm going to live. I'm just going to live with the belief that all of this is awesome for you. Okay, so let's, oh, thank you, Kate. Okay, I promise I'll give you some examples in a little bit. But let me move over now to this other version of the rule. This arbitrarily named individual A, notice, doesn't have a property attached. But let's talk about how this works. So when you have either a universal atomic sentence, a universally quantified atomic sentence, or you have a universally quantified sentence that's not an arrow sentence, right? That's not a conditional claim. You're going to set up universal intro with just the arbitrarily named individual, right? So let's suppose that this sentence that says everything is P, right, is the following property, everything is perfect. Okay, well, let me assume I've got this individual named A, right, Amir. There's this individual named Amir. If from the assumption that there's this individual named Amir, I can infer that Amir is perfect, that means anyone is perfect or everyone is perfect. Again, because A is just randomly chosen. It's like picking a name out of a barrel. Now we'll come back to this language about the arbitrary name not appearing outside the subproof. We'll come back to that in a little bit. But this is the basic setup for each of these versions of the rule. And again, if you like, if you're comfortable with the strategic thinking that we employed in Chapter 6 and Chapter 8, where your subproof rules are your strategic rules, they're the rules that you use to set up a blueprint for your proof, you're going to follow the same method here in Chapter 13. Okay, so here's a little bit more of a discussion about what it is that we're talking about when we have the assumed name. And then what we'll do is we'll look at how this works in Fitch. So take the following argument. All diligent students are hardworking. Anything hardworking is successful. Or you could say, oh, Mia, let's make this specific to, person. So anyone hardworking is successful. So all diligent students are successful. Valid argument. What we need to do is prove the conclusion. So I go ahead and offer up a translation for everything in the universe that's both a diligent thing and a student thing. I know it's awkward language, but there you go. That thing is hardworking, right? And then the second premise is for everything in the universe that's hardworking, that thing is successful. Or for everything that's hardworking, or for every hardworking thing, that thing is successful. Now, what we want to do is prove the arrow claim, right? Every diligent student is successful. So we know that the conclusion is a conditional claim, and we know that the antecedent of the conclusion is What sort of thing? A conjunction. So we go ahead and, or what sort of sentence? The antecedent is a conjunction. So we're going to assume the antecedent, derive the consequent. In order to do that, what we do is assume we're talking about this individual A. Let's call him Alberto. So if Alberto is a diligent student, then he's hardworking, right? Let's assume that Alberto is a diligent student, so he is hardworking, so he is successful, and then we generalize back out. Here's how it looks, and then let's do the same thing in Fitch so that you can see the boxing up of the letter A and all that stuff. But go ahead and take a look at this. Tell me what you think. Notice that what we're doing in these quantifier proofs involves everything that we've been using in chapter 6 and chapter 8 as relevant, right? So we're going to keep using like negation intro, and we're going to use disjunction elem, and we're going to use conditional elem, and we're going to use conditional intro, blah, 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 right? But when you're in that proof, when you're in that subproof, the structuring subproof, notice you've got 2 instances of conditional elem. You already know how to do that.
In the conclusion, you switched hardworking with the successful, right? Like that's the goal.
Right. So we assume the antecedent. We derive the consequent, which happens to not be hardworking, it's successful. And then we start peeling off and providing an instance of our quantifier and variable. Does that answer your question, George?
Yeah, I just switched those two.
Like, yeah, you're exactly right.
Their conclusion.
Yep.
From 2 premises.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Excuse me. Remember, the vast majority of our work when we're in proofs is just, it's a dismantling and a reassembling, right? We're taking sentences apart structurally, we're putting them back together structurally. All right, so that's the universal elem and universal intro. Now I'm going to start, because existential intro is simpler visually, maybe also conceptually, than existential elem. I'm going to start with that, right? So I had started in the universal intro and elem pair. I started with universal elem, but with existential, I'm starting with existential intro. Now, let's talk about a generalization. When I look at making a generalization, I want to be careful. Sorry, hold on just a sec. I'm trying to swallow something and I'm choking. Okay, I'm back. When I make a generalization, I want to be careful about the scope of that generalization, right? So if I say something like this, Chloe loves logic, right? There's nothing that Chloe loves doing more than studying logic. Therefore, everyone loves studying logic. You would say, Mia, no, that's not true, right? My generalization is too broad. I've overstepped my bounds. Think about, just if it helps fix this in your thinking, think about the ways in which we find stereotypes offensive. We find them offensive because they are the result of generalizing generalizing from very few instances to the entirety of a group. And we think, no, that's you can't paint the whole group with the same brush. On the other hand, What I can do, and what you can do, is make much more limited generalizations, and that's what our existential intro allows us to do. If Chloe loves logic, it follows that someone does, which is a much more conservative claim than trying to say Chloe loves logic, therefore everyone does. Right? Remember, if I want to prove a universal, I have to go through this process of grabbing an arbitrary name. Okay. So all we're doing here is this: at some point in your proof, if you want an existential and you don't have the existential, you have a specifically named entity, then you can move to the universal or generalize to the universal or sorry, I kept saying universal. I apologize. Strike that. You can move to the existential. You can generalize to the existential. You can introduce the existential. And then lastly, existential elem. And this is another structuring or strategic subproof rule. So let's talk a little bit about how it works, and then I hope that an example that I give you is helpful to you. Sorry, I had two thoughts going and they collided and I lost my thread. So I'll just stick with the slide. Okay, so here's what we've got. On the, let's just call it the main line. It can be a subproof, but let's just call it the main line for the sake of clarity. You've got an existential claim. It doesn't matter if that existential claim is an atomic sentence or a compound sentence. Doesn't matter if the compound sentence is conjunctions, disjunctions, a combo of that, negations, right? When you have an existentially quantified claim, what you're going to do is assume a name for the variable. So what you do is you move from the existential claim to the subproof, right? So there is something, the thing is a P. Let's assume that A is P. So here we have our randomly chosen name again, right? You might be interested, if you're a big fan of The Simpsons, that there's an episode, a scene from an episode that I find very helpful to understanding the hypothetical name. And if you want to know about it, I'll tell you. In the meantime, right, so you assume that your existentially quantified sentence is relevant to this randomly chosen name. And then from that randomly chosen name, you derive the sentence that you want. So that you can say, look, I've just proven by eliminating that existential that this claim is true, whatever it is, the claim in question is true. Therefore, the claim in question is true. Okay. Now, let's do a quick contrast between universal elem and existential elem so that I hope we can start to see why the elimination of the existential requires the subproof. And then let's look at our a Fitch example or two. So if I look at us, so hold on just a second. I think this will work. Yeah, okay. So I look at all of us and I say, let's exclude me because I know I'm the one yapping. Everyone has muted themselves. Therefore, Eric has muted himself, or therefore Mike has, or Deb has, right? When I have a universal claim, I can pick any name that I want as an instance of that universal claim. Not so, right, with the existential, right? So if I say someone in the Zoom room is muted. Therefore, it's Mia. Therefore, it's Tyler. It's like, well, no, you look at Mia. Mia's yapping. You can hear her. She's not muted. I suppose you might be able to mute me. I don't know. And Tyler, right? Tyler starts talking. Tyler's not muted. So what you have to do is say, well, let's assume that the individual that's muted is named so-and-so. Okay? All right, so before we get into Fitch, let me offer up an example, and then let me address why is that doing that? Oh, I see why it's doing it. Okay. And then let's address one really good question that's come up about the universal intro. Okay. Here's the scenario. You are a medical examiner. In your work, you come across unidentified people. How do you tell the difference between them when you don't know their names? Well, you assign them names. For example, if you have 4 unidentified bodies, you might name them Jane Doe 1 or John Doe 1, right? This is common practice to do. So if you say someone in the morgue, or there are bodies in the morgue, in order for you to differentiate one from the other when you don't know which one you're talking about by just saying someone in the morgue, is you go ahead and assign a name. It's an assumptive name, right? John Doe, Jane Doe, that's an assumptive name. It's not the actual name. It's a hypothetical name. How are we doing with this? Are we ready to look at an example in Fitch? Okay, if so, let's do this. Okay, so we have a universal as our conclusion, and so we know that we're going to use universal intro. So we have as a conclusion a universally quantified sentence. There is a connective in that sentence. It's not an atomic sentence. So we ask ourselves, well, what connective is it? It's a conditional. So we say, I use conditional intro. I'm using universal intro, but of the conditional variety. So yes, you're exactly right to say that universal intro is bound up with conditional intro when the connective in that universal intro is an arrow, whether it's the only or the main. So here we're going to do the following. So do you see this drop-down menu that I'm circling? We haven't touched it all semester long. Did you ever wonder what it was for? Hello, it's for our assumptive name. And then notice what Fitch does. In order to specify that this is a hypothetical or assumptive name, the mechanism, the Fitch program puts a little box around it. So let's assume that A is a cube. Now we're just in the following position. Namely, we're going to peel off our universally quantified claims. Oh, nobody corrected me when I did this earlier. Bad. Right, and then, but that's okay, because even if you didn't correct me, eventually I would have noticed, because Fitch would have told me I did something wrong. Right? So now we're in the position to do what? Eliminate. Oh, sorry, I didn't mean to type that. Eliminate the arrow. Eliminate the arrow. And you ready for your, oopsie, sorry. There's your General conditional universal intro. What do we think? Pretty good. And remember, we know that the argument is valid simply because of its structure. If we were to say, you know what, I don't like the fact that, Mia made cubes dodecs, that's impossible. Well, that's okay then. You just go through and get rid of blocks language. Okay, so, what else did I do wrong? I forgot my parentheses for scope of quantifier. So what do you guys think? I mean, I know we got a couple thumbs up, which is great. Right, so what are we doing? Eliminating the universal. Eliminating the universal. And, there are going to be times when you'll have the option to eliminate a quantifier. Let's keep it at the universal for right now. There will be times when you have the option to eliminate a universal, and you decide you want to do something else first. There are no restrictions. We're going to talk about more restrictions in a little, or sorry, we haven't talked about restrictions. We will talk about restrictions on Thursday, but suffice it to say, there are no restrictions on the universal. So if you were to say, oh, I'm going to do something else first, and then I'll instantiate my universal, you can certainly do that. Depends on what you're given, but that's the basic idea. Right, so now we've got our conditional elem and another conditional elem. And we're in good shape. Okay, so those are our basics. In terms of the sort of bare minimum that we want to have, we've got it. So congratulations to you. And unless you have questions, problems, confusions, let's plan to pick up on Thursday with some practice. And here's what I'm hoping. If we work, as we work through practice, some of the confusions that typically arise will come up, and so that we can, and as a result, we'll be able to talk through some of the more important details of our quantifier rules. Okay? So what do you think? Questions, problems, confusions? No? Yay! All right, guys, then I'll see you on Thursday.